Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Professor Ann Amon, the Dean of PLU's College of Natural Sciences, and I'd like to welcome you to our 7th Rachel Carson Lecture. This lecture is funded by a generous donation from Dr. George Long, a PLU alumnus in biology and chemistry from the class of 1966, and his wife, Helen. Please join me in thanking George and Helen for helping make this event possible. Before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and respect the traditional caretakers of this land, the Nisqually, Puyallup, Squaxin Island, and Steilacoom peoples. Our distinguished speaker this evening is Dr. Banu Subramaniam, the Luella Lemare Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Wellesley College. A plant biologist by training, she earned her PhD from Duke University studying evolutionary plant biology. As a pioneer in feminist science studies, her work explores the complex intersections of biology, culture, and politics. Tonight's talk is based upon her most recent book, Botany of Empire, Plant Worlds and the Scientific Legacies of Colonialism, published in June of 2024. In this work, she challenges us to rethink the history of botany and the global movement of plants through the lens of scientific and colonial legacies. She is also author of Holy Science, the Biopolitics of Hindu Nationalism, and Ghost Stories for Darwin, which won the 2016 Ludwig Fleck Prize. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Subramaniam.
Good evening. Now that you've all been well fed and you've had a warm milk dessert, I am going to sing you a lullaby so you can all go to sleep. Well, I really wanted to thank Ann Alman and also the Rachel Carson Planning Committee for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here and really honored to be celebrating the legacy of Rachel Carson, and also Laura Lee Hagan, who has been so kind with her hospitality all day. I'm really, really grateful. Thank you. Is this not on? Humans are bodies in motion. We move with our hands and legs, on prosthetics and wheelchairs, on horses, donkeys, camels, on ships, planes, trains, and automobiles. Muscles propel motion. Hearts beat, blood circulate, food digests, lungs respire. Our bodies move atop continents forever in motion. Using the power of indeterminate growth, plants are constantly in motion as their limbs seek sun-soaked canopies, their roots move deep and wide in search of water and nutrients. Plant pollen and seeds disperse afar through human, more than human, and elemental life. Fungal hyphae span the planet. Life on Darwin's majestic and tangled banks clothed with plants, singing birds, flitting insects, crawling worms in damp earth, continues to celebrate a vibrant, embrangled life, forever inventive, ingenious, and playful. Yet in a few centuries, we have decimated the planet. Rachel Carson led a piercing warning call about what we were doing to the planet. It urged environmental regulations that stopped the powerful from treating the world around us as a toxic dump. Yet, 62 years later, we are undoing this legacy. Why? How did we get here? There are many ways to tell this story, and here I want to do it through plants and the science of botany. But before I do that, I want to give you a brief introduction to the field I belong to, feminist science and technology studies, and here I want you to wake up because it's a mini quiz. And part of the fundamental argument of my field is that feminism and categories of gender, race, sexuality, class are central to everything because it is everywhere. So do these have a sex or gender? How so? Someone said very definitively yes. Exactly, right? And so you would think a lock and a key, computer plugs shouldn't have a sex and, but yet we talk about male parts and female parts. This is the International Space Station. Does it have? I'm very patient. It's a she because all ships are she's. That's a, yeah, good argument. Someone was going to say something there? Yeah, cars, you know, all things are she's, which is true. So I was a few years ago at the National Air and Space Museum in DC, and they told the story about how the US has a space station, Russia has a space station, and the astronauts of both wanted to meet. And so they had to build a bridge to connect the two space stations. Only neither Russia nor the US wanted to be female. So they had to build a bridge with two male parts. And I tell you this story because, people often say male, female, white, black, what does it matter? But in fact, it matters a lot because each of these categories have rich histories that shape what we think about these categories. And so when we use these words and these categories, they come with those centuries of meaning with them. And so this was the first homosexual union in space that happened. Do these have sex and gender? Yes, indeed. We talk about boy flowers and girl flowers and boy trees and girl trees. We have race everywhere in the animal world. So if you just think, for example, of dog breeds, we have more racialized breeds and more pretty friendly, royal-looking breeds. DNA, which we call the holy grail of life or the master molecule, but except it couldn't do anything with a whole machinery of cell organelles around that help DNA do its work. And this is much like any building you go into. You find out who the architect is, but not the people who put down the floors, the electricity, the plumbing. The workers' labor is always undervalued, and we always value the brains behind it, when in fact it takes all of it to make any body work or any building constructed. So in short, what we have done is we have taken human ideas, human structures, social vocabularies, we have put them into the non-human world, so we have anthropomorphized the world outside, and then we naturalize the non-human world by saying, ducks rape, flowers are male and female, trees are male and female, there is race in dog breeding, When we talk about cells, there's class in there. So suddenly the non-human world looks very much like the human world. And so we naturalize the non-human world into the human. And we constantly build these cycles, because it's not as though these categories are stable. They change over time. But at the heart of what I want to ask today is, which human does this natural world that we have built look like? And so we will come back to this. And the other central concept in the field is that certainly the way I was taught, that science was always seen as outside of culture, that science was unbiased, value-free, that somehow when we walked into a lab, we mysteriously took all our heritage and any bias outside and we could be objective scientists. When in fact, if you look at the history of science, science is very much within culture. Science is practiced by scientists, and scientists bring their cultural assumption, their historical periods into the work that we do. Years ago, plants would have seemed like an odd focus to revisit the histories of colonialism. But research for my recent book that Anne mentioned, Botany of Empire, really, really astonished me. And here I want to, is Lauren here? So Lauren McLaughlin, who is the executive editor of University of Washington Press, and also editor of all my books, and Jennifer Cornu, who is the production manager of University of Washington Press. Anyone who has written a book knows it takes a village to make a book, and so I'm very grateful the two of them are part of mine. So thank you for coming. Understanding plant worlds through history reveals how central colonialism was to plant worlds and vice versa. Early in my biological education, I learned that animals were mobile, using their muscles and skeletons to move, while plants are stationary and rooted in place. Today, I question the work such narratives do. The history of colonial botany is a story about more than plant worlds, how some plants, animals, and colonized humans were used by and for the colonial project. By centering the plant, we see how colonists remade plants in their image for their need, consumption, profit, and for empire. By separating the world into nature and culture, biology elides the role humans have on the environment. We need to bring the human back into the natural, or rather a nature cultural world. I use the term embrangled instead of entangled or intertwined to capture the state of being embroiled and mired in something, not merely just entangled. Interdisciplinarity can help us understand the fraught history of nature cultural entanglements, and in so doing, introduce generative alternatives to the study of global flora. Any history of Western environmental thought begins with Genesis. God created man in his own image, male and female. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on earth." When Europeans began to travel, they built empires across the world, and thus began the age of exploration. And in exploring the world, one of the things they realized is there were people everywhere. And so the church, the kings and queens in Europe, developed this international law, the doctrine of discovery, which basically said that if there were no Christians in a land, then there were no people there, and therefore it was terra nullius, or land that could be conquered. And this is international law that lives on to this day, that allowed the creating of empire across the globe. Within the US, the westward expansion went through this idea of manifest destiny, that through Christian heritage, it was the right of colonizers to colonize new land and make it there. So what consequence did this have? And here I find Leanne Simpson very useful in the ways in which she describes the colonial script. Really, what the colonizers have always been trying to figure out is, how do you extract natural resources from the land when the peoples whose territory you're on believe that those plant and animal and minerals have both spirit and therefore agency? And she answers in 3 parts. 1, you use gender violence to remove indigenous people and their descendants from the land. 2, you remove agency from plant and animal world, so they are now its and not living beings. And then you reposition the land as natural resources for the use and betterment of white people. Colonialism is fundamentally a story of violence, a teeming, inventive life on Earth decimated, cleaved into hierarchies of human and non-human, superior and inferior, master and slave, native and alien. A vital, vibrant planet rendered into desolate landscapes of cracked and crushed Earth. An ecological apocalypse of pillaged lands and peoples through slavery and empire. So much of history remains grounded in the internal histories of the West and the biosciences. The power and enduring legacy of colonialism is best captured by the term coloniality. And as Edward Glissant argues, West is not a place, it is a project. Colonialism wasn't a historical blip or moment in history, but an enduring installation, an infrastructure of coloniality, epistemologies, methodologies, and methods. Coloniality's infrastructure, grounded on race and gender, erased and marginalized other models of social organization and a myriad local systems the world over to create a monoculture of knowledge. One of the key insights of feminist work on the sciences is that even though nature is consistently gendered female, like we say, Mother Nature, biology has persistently shaped the workings of nature as masculine and patriarchal. The rise of botany transposed colonial views of binary sex and gender, compulsory heterosexuality, and Eurocentrism onto nature. No surprise then that there is more scientific work on competition than on cooperation, more on conflict than on coexistence, more on battle between the sexes than on joyful cooperative living. Science, in short, has transformed the majestic, deep history of plant time into the reductionist linear time of botany. Colonial thought has remade plant worlds in their image. We can see how biology came to be rooted not in the land, but in colonial scripts. I focus on the stories we tell about place, and in 3 acts, I trace botanical history to challenge binary terms such as native and foreign, male and female, and I offer it as a serious reflection on the term invasive species and plant reproduction. I conclude with developing an idea of migrant ecologies. Act 1. Plants were reimagined through colonialism as botany, where the deep time of plants are compressed into the regimes of human time and capital. They were imagined as gentlemen and ladies on nuptial beds, as husbands and wives, and their reproductive parts imagined as human genitalia. Botanists discovered plants and animals long known to the Nacals, and then the locals, and then they were renamed in Latin terminology. Consider the biography of some species that we consider invasive species. Kudzu. Kudzu was first exhibited in the World's Fair in Philadelphia in 1876. And at that time, the USDA was very worried about soil erosion. And so they were looking for a plant that might help prevent increased soil erosion. And the Japanese pavilion was kudzu. And it seemed like a wonderful plant. It had a strong taproot, it fixed nitrogen, it grew very well. And so the USDA decided to send volunteers to farmers across the South, and they paid farmers per hectare to plant kudzu on their lands. Farmers did. Kudzu did very well. It grew very well. And today we call it an evil plant, the mile-a-minute plant, and look for ways to eradicate it. And we could say that for the Amur honeysuckle, the Japanese knotweed, the Japanese barberry. Lady Hastings, the wife of the first British Governor-General, introduced the water hyacinth into India for its beauty. Today, it is the invasive terror of Bengal. Purple loosestrife, introduced for its ornamental and medicinal use, is now deemed invasive. Yet others were imported for biological control and vilified when the experiments failed. The list goes on: garlic mustard, Phragmites, tamarisks, Japanese honeysuckle, Chinese privet, and the curiously named tree of heaven. A vast majority were brought here not by lay people, but trained biologists, plant explorers, horticulturalists, agriculturalists, plant breeders, ecologists, forest managers. This was the hubris of science and scientists gone awry. And yet environmental management today doesn't blame science or scientists, but rather the organisms that were willingly or unwillingly, wittingly or unwittingly, through guile or persuasion, through greed and desire, invited into the borders of the nation. So thinking contemporary invasion biology alongside colonial botany reveals a profound botanical amnesia. The kind of borders that we have built today, the kind of rhetoric we have around invasive species was not true even 100 years ago. So Alfred Crosby, in the wonderful Columbian exchange, which we had a good experience at dinner of the ways in which different vegetables and spices have moved across the globe and transformed. Like, I can't imagine Indian food without green chilies, but it came to us through these colonial routes. And part of what Alfred Crosby argues is that the roots of European domination of the Western world lie in their creating new Europes wherever they went. Settler colonists ravaged native populations of humans, plants, and animals. Where Europeans went, their agriculture and animals went. They thrived while indigenous ecosystems collapsed. And the USDA sent plant biologists across the world to find interesting plants, exotic plants, plants that smelled nice, plants that looked weird, anything that was interesting, to bring them back. One scientist, David Fairchild, one person brought over 200,000 species back into the US. The American Acclimatization Society, someone said, why don't we introduce all the birds named in Shakespeare's plays into New York Central Park? Like, why not? And so they did. And part of this is to contrast within 100 years how much things have changed and the ways in which we think about the foreign today as opposed to 100 years ago. And particularly striking to me is the question in the US is who the native is, right? The native in this discourse are not Native Americans, but rather the white settlers who have renamed themselves as the natives of this nation, the borders whom they want to keep pure for white settler colonial project. And then what we see in the US is after that period of laissez-faire where plants and animals moved around, we begin to see anxiety as we see post-colonial, rather colonial independence movements happening across the globe. And so then you begin to see the enactment of borders. And what is interesting is that the first laws against the foreign were about plant quarantine laws, 1 year before human quarantine laws. So first we have the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and then, of course, a larger Immigration Act. So again, when you track how the foreign in the US, you see it's a nature cultural world. We think of the foreign across species of plants and animals. A biological reckoning means undoing botany's theories of global flora to unravel the coloniality of biogeography. A profound recognition that the frameworks of nature in place and out of place are political constructions, fossilizing particular evolutionary moments as the true native nature for posterity. Biological nostalgia is fundamentally an unecological project. A vast literature reminds us that invasive species are not the problem, but rather the symptom of a much larger problem. Unchecked development, exploitative environmental policy, unbridled capitalist greed, rapacious growth to feed the gods of modernity. In fact, the distribution of naturalized species across the world today are a direct product of the histories of European colonialism. So what this study found, that if you look at species of this, in the colonies of the Spanish, they have very similar foreign species. The Dutch are similar, the British similar. So colonial rule has indelibly shaped the biota of the world across. So if we think with plants, something very different emerges. Study after study chronicle how natives, along with early and new migrants, have created novel ecosystems, creating novel natures. Because a lot of these introductions happened a few hundred years ago, and nature has evolved in the meantime. The complex history of motility and mobility and migrations of multi-species biologies is the story of our planet, its past, present, and future. So how do we jettison the unhelpful and unproductive language of native and foreign? How can we distance ourselves from the colonial theories of plant origin stories? Just as humans have more than a few races, plants have more than native and foreign monikers. They have complex histories and biologies. Rather than native and invasive ecologies, I suggest we move to migrant ecologies, which I'll come to. Act 2. We talk about plants as rooted, stationary, sessile, immobile. But that is only true if we understand mobility in human terms, namely moving limbs. But plants have evolved innumerable ways to travel. Their limbs stretch, their roots explore, their pollen and seeds disperse far and wide. They reach each other through insects, birds, bats, and mammals. They engage the elements, water, fire, earth, air. Their migratory paths exploded through colonial travel. As Ruth Ozeki notes, every seed has a story, encrypted in a narrative line that stretches back for thousands of years. And if you trace that story, traveling with that little seed backward in time, you might find yourself tucked into an immigrant's hatband or sewn into the hem of a young wife's dress as she smuggles you from the old country into the new world. Or you might be clinging in the belly of a wool of a yak as you travel across the steppes of Mongolia. Or perhaps you are eaten by an albatross and pooped out on some rocky cropping where you and your offspring will put down roots to colonize that foreign shore. Seeds tell the story of migrations and drifts. So if you learn to read them, they are very much like books. Sex, gender, race, and sexuality thus loom large in our theories of migration. Reductive logics of heteronormative reproduction ground all stories of biological evolution, plant, animal, and human. We must recognize the limited language not only about sexuality, but also community, intimacy, and belonging. The point is not whether plants have sex or not. The point is our obsession with sex and our inability to think and talk about the biological without the language of sex. We reduce the thoroughly inventive and playful intimacies of plants into tired old scripts of Victorian gentlemen and ladies. As Landa Schiebinger reveals, these were categories Carl Linnaeus used for scientific classification that was both abstract and universal. Linnaeus gave primacy to plant sexuality, and his scientization of botany coincided historically with the ardent sexualization of plants. Schiebinger argues that the scientific revolution and the revolution in sexuality and gender came together to elevate plant sexuality as a central focus in botany. And Linnaeus's taxonomy came from, in his Systema Naturae, was focused on the idea of nuptiae plantarum, or the marriage of plants. While we used terminology such as stamens and pistils before, Linnaeus introduced the word andria and gynia, which means husbands and wives, right? So before this period, we talked about plant sexuality in the terms of stamens and pistils, of ovules and pollen, but Linnaeus really translated them into human sexual biology. And so if you look at, for example, the bottom part of it, there is an exact corresponding botanical reproductive part for every human reproductive part. So plants were literally imagined in human genetical terms. And similarly, over 85% of flowering plants have both stamens and pistils in them, but we talk about them as male and female, so now we'll say there are male trees and female trees, male flowers and female flowers, or male and female parts on the same flower. So they can be monoecious or dioecious, or they may be bisexual. But of course, plants do something very, very different. And so in order to accommodate the vast diversity of what it is plants do, we have had to invent innumerable terms in botany. So plants are androecious if they only have male flowers. They are gynoecious if they only have female flowers. They're androdioecious if they have male flowers on some plants and bisexual ones on the other. They're gynodioecious if they have hermaphroditic flowers and female flowers on separate plants. They can be androgynomonoecious, andromonoecious, gynomonoecious, polygamodioecious, polygamomonoecious, subdioecious, subgynoecious, trimonoecious, trioecious. I could go on, but I'll stop. But you get the idea that we have created a system of a very reductive way of thinking about plant biology modeled on Victorian gentlemen and ladies, and plants don't do that, and so we have had to invent terms in order to do that. We must also ask, do plants even have sex? Males and females never meet, touch, meet, engage. If sex is about union, closeness, attraction, intimacy, contact, engagement, feeling, pleasure, who exactly is having sex here? Flowers are intimate with insects, birds, bats. Intimacy is fostered through millions of years of coevolution. They're intimate with the wind as the pollen glides in its flow, intimate with water as pollen floats into its streams. Indeed, the ovule has no contact with the flower from which the pollen originates. Always one degree of separation. Even if they self-fertilize, there is no intimate contact. An ableist vocabulary in biology laments the sessile, grounded, immobile plant. Yet this cursory overview of plants show them as wildly agentic plant worlds. It is about movement, mobility, about ability. It is playful, affective, community, intimacy with the world around. As pollen and seeds travel with the flows of the winds, the waves of the water, the power of fire, the wetness of earth, the beaks of birds, the legs of bees, the fur of animals, the pull of gravity, and the products traded by globalized humans. Pollen and seeds of plants travel far and wide, not like humans surely, but an evolutionary strategy that far exceeds and likely outlives the human. We can and must undo the language of colonial botany. For example, Madeline Bartlett and I suggest we understand plant morphology and anatomy not through human genitalia, but plants themselves. We suggest abandoning male and female, either rejecting sex and gender altogether or re-theorizing them as quantitative traits. I want to propose migrant ecologies as an antidote to the binary language that pervade biology: native, alien, male, female, heterosexual, homosexual. A counter-colonial approach, migrant ecologies offers a practical and pragmatic planetary ecology for the afterlives of colonialism that we find ourselves in. Migrant ecologies do not arise from plant ecological sciences of contemporary biology, but rather from nature-cultural approaches to plant worlds and the histories of colonial extractive economies that unleashed a grand shuffling of plants, animals, and humans during colonial regimes. It arises from the ongoing neo-colonial extractive regimes of commerce and trade, unchecked development of land, and the refusal to act on the urgent signs of hastening climate change. The theorizing of migrant ecologies are both useful and necessary for our moment for many reasons. First, they offer, rather than just a natural theory or a cultural theory, a nature-cultural approach to understand the world. in asking ourselves, how did we get here? And in order to answer how did we get here, we need to include human, more than human, plant and animal life in it. And it forces us to recognize that the majority of foreign species are here because of their colonial history, especially their horticultural approaches. It helps us tackle multiple genealogies of colonialism: the post-colonial, the anti-colonial, the decolonial, the counter-colonial, and indigenous ecologies together. It offers an affective ecology so that we can center the plant, animal, and human as complex embodied beings and recognize the plasticity that plants and animals show. It helps us transcend species and taxa so we don't only narrate biological through biological classification, but thinking beyond that in thinking about migrations as acts that include various modes such as voluntary, forced, and coerced migration. It embraces a transnational vision of planetary life as we track the overflows and underflows of life on Earth. It embraces change and fluidity by recognizing that evolution is never static. Organisms are forever adapting and changing, and change is the norm rather than the exception. It recognizes the interdependence of human diasporas and botanical diasporas, insisting on relationality that link migrating communities. It recognizes that human diaspora and botanical diasporas have the same etymology: to scatter about or to disperse around. Refusing the binaries of native and alien, diasporas insist on relationality, on lateral inheritance rather than only reproductive vertical inheritance. In short, invasive ecologies and binary reproduction are fundamentally unecological and ahistorical, while migrant ecologies, attuned to the histories of botanical colonization, recenter political ecologies of botanical commerce, market forces, horticultural innovations, technologized and reproductive labor, and industrialized agriculture. Climate change has only made the environment more volatile, increasing periods of drought, floods, fire, which are now routine. A botanical history reminds us that plant biogeography is a product of colonial extractive economies, continued human greed for larger houses and cheaper disposable products. Plant reproductive biology has colonized plant evolutionary potential into products that can be patented, bought, and sold. Short-term profits have again and again been chosen instead of long-term health of the planet. Migrant ecologies is not an embrace of an anarchic development, but confronting colonial legacies with responsibility and accountability. It recognizes that common responses, such as eradicating invasive plants without changing the larger ecological and political context, is a Sisyphean task. It offers us nature-cultural modes to rethink multi-species ecologies in histories of enduring political colonial economies. The story of plant life is the story of Pangaea, the supercontinent that fractured into continental formations, moving species leading to a dizzying evolutionary adaptation. Then, in a flash of planetary time, colonialism reknit the seams of Pangaea. Biological exchanges and movement created a world-spanning economic system. In the deep history of human evolution, we are all migrants out of Africa. The embrangled story of life on Earth is not singular or universal, but complex and multiple. There is nothing innocent about this. Complex histories have shaped these migrations. As the quip goes, we are here because you were there. Migrations have been forced, coerced, and voluntary. These are tales of abjection, enslavement, victimization, but also ones of opportunity, adventure, celebration, and joy. Primarily trained as an evolutionary biologist, life on Earth for me is never about stasis or being rooted in one place. As Lewis Carroll's Red Queen famously quipped, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. Inspired by Charles Darwin, I dreamed of a polyphonic, polymorphic biological imagination. Growing up in post-independent, multi-religious India, life was about plurality. In my lifetime, I have been stunned by the rise of an insular nativism and nationalism in both the country of my birth and now citizenship, a violent, virulent xenophobia across species. Even more remarkable is that in both nations, the majority claim victimhood from the minority. Histories of colonialism brought us here. Today, rather than reject colonial scripts, our leaders have embraced them. Capture Greenland, undo regulations that interfere with profit, and of course, drill, baby, drill. While the biota of the world have profoundly have been shaped by colonialism, migrant life did not begin with European colonialism. Humans, animals, and plants have always moved. After all, in the deep history of life on Earth, who belongs where? With the continents constantly in motion, we are never still. Life evolves through the everyday, through peace and tumult, through greed and grace. This is what the planet is, a dynamic planet of mutating, migrating, and mobilizing more than human worlds. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Subramaniam, for your thought-provoking presentation. At this time, we have time for a few questions. So if you have a question, we'll bring a microphone to you. Please raise your hand.
If I'm to take one thought from this presentation, what is the most important thing you would ask me to remember?
That we need to understand plant biology as theories that are not about plants, but rather about colonial human worlds. And so we need to be questioning the ways in which we describe plants, the ways in which we talk about plant ecology, plant reproduction, plant naming. And that maybe we need to imagine a future biology where we look at plants to describe what they do and not make them in our image.
Hello. I'm wondering about so you've talked about how humans have created, as you said, the plant worlds and like in our own image. Do you think that in a way of perhaps like reckoning with colonial past and imagining new futures, we could maybe look to the way that like plant worlds naturally are as a way to could the reverse happen?
I think so, yes. I think that there are many other ways in which, so first of all, there are many cultures across the world, right? That even though there was terra nullius and Western colonists claimed land, erased local naming practices, erased local understandings of plants, and then introduced this Latin nomenclature. There are other theories about plants and how plants work. So there is a thriving field of indigenous ecologies, of queer and trans ecologies, where people describe plants' world in very different ways. They're still looking at plant biology, right? But using that data to tell different kinds of stories than the stories traditional botany tells. And so, yes, there are lots of different imaginations there. And a lot of it is, of course, plants do so many different things. And you're right, plants might also inspire us to think about other models by which we can live. So yes, I think it can go both ways.
Thank you. Thank you. I was actually going to ask a question that you pretty much just answered. It was going to be, have you explored the indigenous ways of knowing and sort of other people's ways of looking at plants, and is that your next book?
No, other people have written this, you know, there's a lot of really great work on indigenous ecologies. So for example, there's some work looking at the Anishinaabe people where if a plant that is not, so fundamentally indigenous ecologies are developed around relational models. Plants are not objects there for our consumption, our extractive ambitions, but rather our relatives. And so it's developing a world where we have relationships with the plants and animals around us. So there's some wonderful work looking, for example, at the Anishinaabe people, where if some plant that they don't know comes, they don't immediately say, oh, this is a foreign plant, get away. They use that as a way to say, why is this plant here? Where did it come from? And so it opens up those questions of history, of ecology, of what is happening differently around us. So it opens up a much more rich vocabulary than I would argue we traditionally have in botany, where there are these litmus tests of what we should have in our gardens. There are some cities that legislate what percentage of your garden should be native. Yeah, this happened in Nazi Germany as well, where purity was not just about blood purity of humans, but purity of gardens as well.
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering if you'd seen any progression in our terminology nowadays, like when you mentioned things like, of course, that image of how Rachel Carson would be rolling in her grave. My first thought was how we have always seen plants being named by people, like example, the Gary oak versus its indigenous name. Have we seen like a sort of step back into the quote unquote right direction where we're starting to rename things back to what either they were in indigenous ways, or if we're even finding a newfound terminology that could be universal?
Yeah.
If you've just seen any progression or any good news.
Yeah, but except that, you know, we could, colloquially, we can do a lot in terms of bringing other words that have been forgotten. And very often local names actually describe the plant. You know, this is yellow colored what, or it helps with this or helps with that. And that gets erased, where a lot of the Latin names were about kings and queens or rulers or military people. I think you're right, we can bring those names back, but to officially change them, there is an international committee that names, so it has to go through them. And guess who controls those international committees? So there are people who have been, people who have been trying to push, especially, you know, during this move when we are talking about who buildings are named after, who we have statues about, that maybe we need to be thinking about plant names as well. But it is not an easy task because it has to go through these colonial infrastructures that theorists have talked about.
My question is similar to that one, but in terms of creating a paradigm shift in the language that we use and the way we approach science, botany, what have you, how do you best suggest that we do something like that? Where can we start? What can we do? How do we bring that shift to our collective?
I think we start, I mean, you can start one right here, right? So for example, at Wellesley in the Botanical Gardens, there is a naming project. And some of it is not only using the scientific name of the plant, but as students come from all over the world, students also do research and pull out local names for that same plant from across the world. So they are in different languages, they can be translated. So one way to start is to, you know, bring out these multiple names that plants have across the world, and rather this universal language that for a lot of people can be very alienating. At least for me, I grew up knowing plants by a certain name, And to me, a botanical education was really a project of alienation, where to learn all the, memorize these Latin names that I did not recognize and did not describe anything that I knew about them. So some of it might be, rather than a universal vocabulary, of creating a multiplicity, a plurality of words. There's no reason the experts can't keep using the Latin name, but it doesn't mean everyone has to use them. So one maybe, I know several of you work in the greenhouse of beginning a naming project here and bringing names, in beginning to use common names as a way to bring out these histories, to understand what it is. I mean, we were talking earlier today, we eat so few of what is on our dinner plates, a very narrow number of grains and fruits and vegetables, which are species that biotechnology was able to genetically manipulate to be shelf-stable, so they could travel across the globe, that they could stay on the shelves. But there's a lot of species that people have eaten that have been part of these entangled worlds of people in North America for a very long time. And so some of it might be, doing history not only about people, but also doing history of people and plants together, to think about other ways in which plants, animals, and humans have had entangled lives together in the past, and bringing that back.
I also have a question similar. While you've been answering these questions, I've been thinking a lot about field guides. Like, I grew up so connected to nature, but through field guides, and I'm realizing while sitting here how colonial those are, and with these conversations of more multiplicity and place-based names and that kind of thing, how do you see an alternative or a change to things like educational field guides and stuff? And how can that science be communicated to students and kids growing up?
I think you made a wonderful proposal just now. You don't need to look at me. So I think those are wonderful ideas of creating alternate field guides. I mean, I think at least at where I am, zines are very popular. There's no reason student projects and classes can't be about creating local field guides that both unearth those histories, but have recipes of plants we don't normally eat.
Hello.
Hello.
So since it is established that invasive species do have a negative impact on their ecosystem, I want to hear your thoughts on the efforts around bringing back indigenous ecosystems, including the inherent nature that plants are very, migration is inherent to plant life.
So how to bring back indigenous ecologies? Is that what you're saying? No. Okay, so this is a complicated question, right? One is, are we giving the land back, or? Right? We would have to think about that. Because in part, indigenous ecologies are not just about these individuals here and these people there. It is about relationality. It is about belonging. It is about, entangled lives. The other thing to me is the idea of the native in indigenous studies and the native of invasion biology, I don't think are the same. And so to me, the native of invasive species is a very colonial terminology, where there is no relationship with the plant. It is a litmus test. Are you here or not here? So in order for us to develop indigenous, I also, one of the things I worry about in this moment where the indigenous has gotten a certain cultural cachet is that we don't recolonize, right? So the point is not about reappropriating indigenous ideas to build indigenous ecologies. So if we are serious about indigenous ecologies, it is about giving land back, about building collaborative arrangements with indigenous people, so we are not appropriating knowledge, but about building a world together. So ultimately, these have to be political projects. They can't just be about taking knowledge and using it. And so it's a bigger project of community building, of collaboration, of reimagination. But you're absolutely right, we can't, and even indigenous ecologists would say that, you can't go back to what indigenous ecology was 500 years ago. Ecologies have changed, land has changed, the planet has changed, we have climate change upon us. So we have to rethink in the current, in terms of who is here, in terms of who can live with each other, and rebuild a vision for the future. And so there are biologists now who are not working with going back to the past, but imagining what the future climate is going to be and working towards the future.
Thank you, Dr. Subramaniam. As we conclude tonight's lecture, Dr. Subramaniam has graciously agreed to sign books for us in the back. We have copies of Botany of Empire available for sale. So if you are interested, please line up at the back of the room with books for Dr. Subramaniam to sign. Thanks again for joining us this evening, and have a great night.